There was blood on the front porch. That is not a rumor. That is not something pieced together from online theories or secondhand accounts. When investigators arrived at the home of Nancy Guthrie in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona, blood was on the porch, the front door was propped open, and an 84-year-old woman who had lived in that house for years was simply gone. No note, no signs of a rushed struggle inside, no broken windows, no damaged locks, just absence. And that kind of silence, investigators will tell you, is often louder than any chaos left behind. Today, we are going deeper into what authorities have uncovered since Nancy disappeared, and some of what has come to light raises serious questions, not just about what happened to her, but about how this investigation was handled from the very first hour. Before we get into it, if you are new here, please subscribe right now. This case is still developing, and we are committed to bringing you every update as it comes in. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old and had lived in her Catalina Foothills home for years. This is a quiet, established neighborhood in Tucson where people know their neighbors, where routines hold, and where an unfamiliar face tends to draw a second glance. It is exactly the kind of place where you would expect an elderly woman to be safe. She was not a woman who lived carelessly. She had a pacemaker that monitored her heart around the clock. She had medication she depended on. She had family nearby. And on the night she vanished, February 1st, 2026, she had spent the evening doing something completely ordinary, having dinner at her daughter Annie's home. By all accounts, that visit was normal. Nothing tense, nothing unusual, nothing that anyone present described as alarming. Nancy spent a few hours with her family, the way she had done many times before, and when the evening wound down, her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, drove her home. That part of the story has not been disputed by anyone. He pulled up to her residence in the Catalina Foothills, and according to official accounts, he waited long enough to watch her go inside. He saw the garage door open, he saw her enter, and then he left. That moment, Nancy stepping through that garage door, is the last confirmed visual of her alive. What happened next falls inside a window of time that investigators have been studying carefully ever since. At approximately 1:47 in the morning, Nancy's doorbell camera went offline. Now cameras go offline for all kinds of reasons: power surges, technical glitches, connectivity drops. On its own, that detail might not mean much, but investigators say this camera did not simply fail. According to what authorities have pieced together, the system was accessed remotely using the correct login credentials. Whoever interacted with that camera did not guess their way in. They knew the information, they knew how to use it, and they knew exactly when to act on it. 41 minutes later, at approximately 2:28 in the morning, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker transmitted its final signal. 41 minutes, that is the window. Everything that happened to Nancy Guthrie, whatever was done by whoever was responsible, took place inside those 41 minutes. And what makes that window so significant is not just its length, it is what was not there. There was no forced entry, no broken frame around a door, no shattered glass, no evidence that anyone had to fight their way into that house. In residential crimes involving a stranger, entry points almost always leave traces. Locks show stress. Doors crack. Something breaks. None of that was present here. Which means whoever entered Nancy Guthrie's home that night did not need to force their way in. They either had access or they had knowledge of the layout, of the systems, of the routine, of what to do and when to do it. When investigators walked through the front door and found blood on the porch and the door still propped open, they were not looking for something dramatic. They were looking for consistency. They were asking, does this scene match what a normal night should look like? And the answer, by every indication, was no. Nancy had left in her pajamas. Her pacemaker medication, the kind she needed to survive, was still in the house. She had not packed a bag. She had not called anyone. She had not walked out of her own free will in any way that left behind a reasonable explanation. She was simply gone. One detail that has received far less attention than it deserves is this. The supervisor who first responded to Nancy Guthrie's home that night had reportedly never investigated a homicide before. A source familiar with the case has raised serious concerns that this lack of experience may have had a real impact during the early hours, the hours that are almost always the most critical in any disappearance. Those first moments shape everything that follows: the evidence collected, the questions asked, the decisions made about what to preserve and what to prioritize. If that foundation is unsteady, it affects the entire case. That concern has not gone away, and as new evidence continues to surface, it is becoming harder to separate what investigators found from how prepared they were to understand what they were looking at. Nancy Guthrie was not a headline. She was a woman who had dinner with her daughter, climbed into a car, walked through her garage door, and was never seen again. And between 1:47 and 2:28 in the morning, something happened inside that house that has still not been fully answered. When we left off, Nancy Guthrie had walked through her garage door at some point in the early hours of February 1st, 2026, and 41 minutes later, her pacemaker went silent. The front door was propped open, there was blood on the porch, and the camera system that should have recorded whatever happened next had already been switched off, not by a malfunction, but by someone who knew exactly how to access it. That detail is where Part 2 begins. Because once investigators confirmed that the camera had been accessed remotely using the correct credentials, the entire shape of the investigation changed. Think about what that actually means. This was not someone who stumbled onto the property and got lucky. This was not a random intrusion where a stranger happened to find an unlocked door. The person who accessed that camera system had the login information. They knew how the system worked, and critically, they knew the right moment to use it, early enough to cut off any recording before anything happened, but not so early that the timing would look completely disconnected from the events that followed. That level of specific working knowledge of a private home security system does not come from guesswork. It comes from exposure, repeated familiar exposure. And that is exactly what turned this investigation in a different direction almost immediately. At the same time that forensic teams were processing the interior of the home, law enforcement made another quiet but significant move. They seized the vehicle that Tommaso Cioni had used to drive Nancy home that night. Now, that decision alone does not confirm guilt or even strong suspicion of any specific person. Investigators seize vehicles in cases like this because vehicles preserve things that people forget or overlook or choose not to mention. Fibers transfer. Biological material settles into upholstery, data logs movement. A vehicle tied to the last confirmed moments of a missing person's timeline becomes, in many ways, a controlled record of that night, one that cannot be edited after the fact. Around this same time, journalist Ashley Banfield reported that law enforcement sources were already discussing Tommaso Cioni internally as a potentially significant figure in the case. He had not been charged. Nothing had been confirmed publicly. But his name had entered the investigative conversation, and once that happens, the scrutiny that follows is thorough. Shortly after, photographs surfaced of Tommaso and Annie leaving their home. He had partially covered his face. She stayed out of clear view. Individually, those choices can be explained in a dozen different ways: stress, grief, a desire for privacy in an impossible situation. But the public had already begun forming a picture, and that picture was difficult to walk back. Then came a major announcement. Authorities stated publicly that the family had been cleared, not tentatively, not with conditions, cleared through witness interviews, evidence review, and forensic comparison that included DNA analysis. That statement, on paper, should have redirected the conversation entirely, and yet it did not. Because once suspicion takes hold in the public mind, a formal statement rarely erases it completely. The case split into two separate tracks: what was playing out in the headlines and what was quietly being built inside labs and investigative briefings. Those two versions of events rarely move at the same speed. Now here is where the investigation gets more complex, and where a source has raised a concern that deserves serious attention. The supervisor who first responded to Nancy Guthrie's home on the night she disappeared had reportedly never investigated a homicide before. A source familiar with the case has spoken out directly about this. asking publicly whether investigators were genuinely focused on preserving evidence from the very beginning. The source pointed to specific details that were known almost immediately: the blood on the porch, the prop door, the fact that Nancy had been separated from her pacemaker at approximately 2:28 in the morning, and raised the question of whether the full weight of those details was understood in those first critical hours. Early investigative decisions shape everything that follows: what gets collected, what gets documented, what gets prioritized. If experience is missing in those first moments, it can create gaps that are very difficult to close later. That concern sits alongside another layer of the investigation that had been quietly developing since before February 1st even arrived. On January 11th, a masked individual appeared at Nancy Guthrie's front door. There was no forced entry attempt, no apparent effort to break in, just a presence, someone standing there, masked, at the home of an 84-year-old woman living alone. Experienced investigators who have reviewed this detail have described it in a specific way, not as a failed attempt, not as a random occurrence, but potentially as a test. In planned operations, the first move is rarely the event itself. It is the observation. You study the environment. You learn the timing. You see how the property responds, whether lights come on, whether a neighbor notices, whether anything interrupts the presence. January 11th, viewed through that lens, begins to look less like an isolated strange moment and more like the first step in a sequence. Then came January 24th. The family specifically asked the public to focus on that date, to check cameras, to revisit memories, to think about whether they saw anything in that window that might have seemed unremarkable at the time. Authorities have not fully explained publicly why that date matters, but the fact that Nancy's own family highlighted it alongside January 11th and February 1st suggests it is not arbitrary. When 3 dates appear before a disappearance and investigators treat them as connected rather than coincidental, they are building toward a theory of preparation, not a spontaneous act, a sequence with a beginning, a middle, and an endpoint. That theory is also why 2 other elements drew sustained investigative attention: a rental property located near Nancy's home and construction activity in the same area. On the surface, those 2 things appear unrelated. But in a neighborhood like Catalina Foothills, where routines are steady, where residents notice unfamiliar vehicles, where unusual movement stands out, both of those things provide something that is very hard to manufacture otherwise: a believable reason to be present. A rental home means you live there, you move in and out. Nobody questions you. Construction work means vehicles come and go at different hours, people move around properties, and none of it looks out of place. Investigators were not examining those elements because they were obvious. They were examining them because they answered a question the neighborhood itself was asking: how does someone move through a place like this without being remembered? There are also 2 conflicting accounts surrounding that rental property that have not been resolved. One version suggests the occupants left before Nancy disappeared. The other suggests they left immediately after. Both cannot be true, but both versions point toward the same underlying question: did that property create a window of unaccountable activity at exactly the wrong moment? And then there is the DNA. Forensic teams recovered DNA from inside the home, but it was not a clean sample. It involved multiple contributors, what investigators refer to as a mixed profile. Separating individual contributors from a mixed DNA sample is not quick work. It requires advanced software, careful reconstruction, and time, a lot of time. That slowness does not mean the case is stalled. It means the most consequential piece of forensic evidence is still being built carefully, because when it is resolved, it will not suggest, it will place. It will put a specific person, physically, inside that home. And in a case where no forced entry occurred, physical placement becomes an extremely powerful thing. That is where it leaves us: the camera accessed by someone with knowledge, the vehicle preserved as evidence, the pre-incident dates forming a pattern, the rental property raising questions that have not been answered, and DNA that is still being untangled, slowly, carefully, with everything riding on what it ultimately shows. By the time we reach this point in the Nancy Guthrie investigation, something important has already happened. Even if it has not made a dramatic headline, the investigation has stopped moving outward and started pulling inward. In Part 2, we walk through the camera access, the seized vehicle, the pre-incident dates, the rental property, and the DNA that is still being carefully untangled. All of those pieces exist independently, but what investigators are now doing is forcing them to agree with each other. And that is the phase where cases either hold together or fall apart. This is where the digital evidence becomes critical. Cell tower analysis is not what most people picture when they hear the phrase. It is not investigators pulling up one suspicious phone and watching it move across a map. It is something far more patient and far more complex than that. Every phone that connects to a tower near a given location during a relevant time window becomes a data point. Not a suspect, not a target, just a signal. And from thousands of those signals, investigators begin building a filter. Thousands of devices become hundreds, hundreds become dozens. And what remains after all of that filtering is a smaller group of signals that behave in ways worth examining more closely. What investigators were looking for was not simply presence. Presence alone means very little in a residential neighborhood. People live there, people drive through, people visit. What matters is pattern. Which devices appeared more than once, which devices showed up in the same general area across multiple dates, and most importantly, which devices changed their behavior during the windows of time that investigators had already flagged as significant. Here is why that last point matters so much. A phone does not simply vanish from a cell network by accident. When a device disappears from tower data during a critical window, it is because something changed. It was powered down, it was moved deliberately outside the coverage area, or it was otherwise taken off its normal pattern. That is a decision, and when multiple devices show similar interruptions during the same critical window, that stops being coincidence and starts being structure. What investigators reportedly found was not one isolated device behaving strangely. They found devices appearing on January 11th, the same devices or devices with similar behavioral patterns appearing again around January 24th, and then those same signals present near the time Nancy Guthrie disappeared on February 1st. 3 dates, 3 appearances, the same pattern repeating across all of them. Coincidence is unpredictable. It does not repeat on a schedule. It does not align with a timeline that investigators had already flagged before the digital data was even analyzed. When something repeats consistently across multiple flagged dates, it becomes part of the structure of the case, not proof on its own, but a framework that connects to everything else already collected. And then there is the movement. Once investigators established that certain devices were present near Nancy's home, they began tracking the direction those devices moved after the critical window closed. What they reportedly found was not random drift in multiple directions. The movement aligned. Devices that had been present near the residential area of Catalina Foothills moved outward after the relevant time frame, not toward busier streets, not toward commercial areas, but toward less visible terrain, toward open land, toward the desert. That finding changed how the physical search was being conducted. Modern search operations in cases like this do not work by sending teams out to walk a grid and hope for the best. They are guided by data. Investigators calculate distance. How far could a person travel within a given time window using available routes without being noticed? They factor in concealment, which areas provide cover, which terrain is difficult to monitor, which locations sit outside the range of residential cameras and streetlights, and then they narrow. The desert terrain surrounding Tucson is vast, but an investigation working from cell tower movement data, a known time window of 41 minutes, and geographic logic does not need to search all of it. It needs to search the part that fits. That is exactly what has been happening, quietly, methodically, and largely away from the cameras. At the same time, Nancy's family has been doing something equally important from a different direction. They have appealed directly to the public, not with theories, not with accusations, but with specific asks. They have asked anyone who was in the area around January 11th, January 24th, and February 1st to go back and check their cameras, home security footage, doorbell recordings, dash cam video from cars parked on the street, anything that captured movement in the neighborhood during those windows, even something that seemed completely unremarkable at the time. That appeal matters more than it might appear. In investigations like this one, breakthroughs do not always come from the evidence collected at the scene. Sometimes they come from a neighbor who noticed a vehicle parked slightly longer than usual and thought nothing of it. Sometimes they come from a dash cam that was running automatically and recorded something in the background that nobody was looking for. One overlooked detail handed to investigators at the right moment can become the bridge between what they strongly suspect and what they can formally prove. And there is meaningful incentive to come forward. A total reward of $1,100,000 is currently being offered in connection with this case. $1 million from Nancy's family, $100,000 from the FBI. Anyone who comes forward can remain completely anonymous. You do not need to be certain about what you saw. You do not need to have hard evidence in hand. Your role is simply to pass along the detail. Investigators take it from there. They build the case. They do the work of determining what matters and what does not. All that is required from you is the detail itself, however small it may seem. If you have any information at all, you can call the FBI directly at 1-800-2255-324. You can also submit a tip online completely anonymously at tips.fbi.gov. Both options protect your identity fully. Here is where the investigation stands right now. There is a confirmed timeline with two fixed endpoints, 1:47 a.m. and 2:28 a.m. There was no forced entry, which removes an entire category of possibility and points toward familiarity. The camera system was accessed by someone with specific knowledge of how it worked. DNA has been recovered but involves multiple contributors and is still being resolved. Cell tower data shows behavioral patterns repeating across 3 dates that investigators flagged months ago. Movement data points toward the desert. A nearby rental property raises questions that have not been fully answered. And the pre-incident appearances, the masked figure at the door on January 11th, the significance of January 24th, suggest that whatever happened on February 1st may not have begun on February 1st at all. This is no longer an investigation searching in every direction at once. It is structured, it is focused, and it is tightening. But despite everything that has been gathered, everything that has been analyzed, and everything that continues to develop behind the scenes, one thing has not changed. The same question that has sat at the center of this case from the very first morning has still not been answered. Where is Nancy Guthrie? She is not a headline. She is not a case number. She is an 84-year-old woman who had dinner with her daughter, came home, walked through her garage door, and has not been seen since. Her family is still looking, investigators are still working, and every single day that passes without an answer is a day that someone, somewhere, may be sitting on a detail that could change everything. If that person is watching this right now, if something you saw, something you noticed, something you almost dismissed is sitting in the back of your mind, please come forward. Call 1-800-225-5324. Go to tips.fbi.gov. You can remain anonymous. You do not need proof. You just need to make the call. We want to hear from you in the comments as well. Of everything that has come out in this investigation, the camera access, the pre-incident dates, the cell tower patterns, the DNA, what detail stands out most to you? What do you think investigators are closest to answering? Leave your thoughts below, and if you have not subscribed yet, please do it now. This case is still developing, and we will be here with every update as it comes in. Nancy Guthrie deserves answers, and this story is not over.